Captain Michael Serra stood in the Thessari Grand Council chamber, knowing with absolute certainty that he was watching a losing argument unfold, and there was nothing he could do to change the outcome. The chamber was packed with Thessari nobles, military commanders, diplomatic advisors, approximately 200 of the empire's most influential voices, all gathered to debate the proposed military intervention in the border territories, where human colonies were being threatened by aggressive expansion from the Verath dominion. The Thessari Empire had a mutual defense treaty with Earth, but actually, invoking that treaty to commit military forces required Grand Council approval, and the debate had been running for 3 hours with no consensus emerging, or rather, with consensus clearly forming in the direction Michael desperately needed it not to go. He was here as the human military liaison, authorized to present Earth's position, but not to vote or directly participate in Thessari internal deliberations beyond his initial presentation. He'd already made his case. The Verath were systematically targeting human colonies, testing Earth's defenses and the strength of the Thessari alliance. Without Thessari military support, the border colonies would fall within months. Thousands of civilians would be killed or displaced. Earth's credibility as a reliable ally would be destroyed. The strategic argument was sound. The moral argument was compelling. The treaty language was clear. None of it was working. Lord Vethros was currently speaking, his voice carrying across the chamber with the practiced authority of someone who'd been shaping Thessari policy for decades. We sympathize deeply with Earth's situation. The Verath aggression is unacceptable, and we have made our diplomatic position clear through formal protests and economic sanctions. However, we must consider our own strategic priorities with clear-eyed realism. His skin shifted to thoughtful blue as he made his case. Committing significant military forces to defend human border colonies, colonies that are, respectfully, relatively minor in terms of strategic value, weakens our positioning in other contested regions. The Verath are testing our resolve on multiple fronts simultaneously. We cannot afford to overextend ourselves for allies who, again, with all respect to Captain Serra and his people, lack the military capability to meaningfully support us in our own conflicts. It was a compelling argument delivered by someone with substantial political influence. Michael could see nobles throughout the chamber showing agreement through skin colors and ear positions, thoughtful blues, calculating golds, resigned silvers. Michael's counterargument, that treaties meant nothing if they were only honored when convenient, that abandoning allies signaled weakness rather than strategic wisdom, that human lives had value beyond strategic calculations, had already been presented and politely acknowledged before being effectively dismissed. The human position is emotionally compelling, another speaker had said earlier, but emotion is not strategy. We must make decisions based on realistic assessment of costs and benefits to the empire. The debate was nearing its conclusion now. Michael could feel it, the way discussions shifted when consensus was forming, when further argument became mere formality before the inevitable vote. The consensus was clear. The Thessari would provide diplomatic support, would lodge formal protests, would offer humanitarian assistance to displaced populations. But they would not commit military forces to defend human colonies. It wasn't a complete abandonment of the treaty. Technically, they were providing support as required. But it wasn't the military intervention that the border colonies desperately needed to survive. Michael knew this outcome had been likely from the start. Earth was the junior partner in this alliance, valuable for technology exchange and cultural cooperation, but not significant enough to justify major military commitments when Thessari's strategic interests pointed elsewhere. He'd tried, had presented the best arguments he could construct, had conveyed the urgency and desperation with as much professional composure as he could maintain. It wasn't enough. Lord Vethros was concluding his remarks. Therefore, I formally propose. The Thessari Empire will provide full diplomatic and humanitarian support to Earth regarding Verath aggression in the border territories. We will impose additional economic sanctions on the Verath Dominion and will offer refuge to displaced human populations. However, we will not commit military forces at this time. We reserve the right to reassess if circumstances escalate to threaten core Thessari interests, but we do not believe current conditions justify military intervention. Several nobles voiced immediate agreement. The motion was clearly going to pass. Michael felt the hope that had brought him here draining away, replaced by sick certainty that he was about to return to Earth with news that the Alliance wouldn't protect them when it mattered most. That was when Queen Isaveth stood. The chamber went immediately quiet, not because she'd commanded it, but because a standing queen signaled she was about to speak with formal authority rather than asking the clarifying questions she'd posed throughout the debate. She descended from the throne platform and walked directly toward Michael. Every eye in the chamber followed her movement. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that protocol would normally require him to step back and maintain respectful distance. He held his position, uncertain what was happening, but recognizing that this moment was significant in ways he didn't fully understand. Queen Isaveth didn't speak immediately, just looked at him with an expression that seemed to be weighing something of profound importance. Her skin shifted through colors too quickly for Michael to interpret. Assessment blue, consideration purple, something gold that might have been decision or determination. Then she did something Michael had never seen in all his months attending Thessari court proceedings. She placed her hand on his shoulder. The gesture was not formal, not ceremonial, not the kind of ritualized contact that Thessari court protocol occasionally required. Just her hand, resting on Michael's shoulder with a familiarity and intimacy that would be inappropriate between monarch and foreign military liaison under any normal circumstances. The chamber went absolutely, profoundly still. Michael could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes focused on them, on the Queen's hand on his shoulder, on the unprecedented intimacy of the gesture, on whatever was about to happen next. Because in Thessari culture, Michael had learned this during his cultural training, physical contact from the sovereign was rare and always meaningful. A handshake was formal acknowledgement. A touch on the arm was recognition of service. But a hand placed on someone's shoulder, held there with deliberate weight, was something else entirely. It signaled trust, personal regard, chosen proximity that transcended formal hierarchy and protocol. Queen Isaveth leaned in close enough that when she spoke, her words would be audible only to Michael despite the chamber's acoustic engineering that normally carried every sound to every corner. She whispered. Michael couldn't see the faces of the assembled council members from his position, but he could imagine their reactions. Because apparently, from everything his cultural training had covered, a whisper from the Thessari throne carried specific cultural weight that he didn't fully understand, but that everyone else in the chamber recognized immediately. What the Queen said was quiet, meant only for him, but the words settled into Michael's awareness with absolute clarity. I have heard your arguments and I have seen your conviction. You speak not for strategic advantage, but for lives that will be lost if we choose comfort over commitment. That matters more than the Council's calculations. Trust me. The words themselves were significant, but Michael understood instinctively that what mattered equally was the act of whispering, the public gesture of private communication, the visible intimacy of words spoken only for one listener while 200 witnesses watched. Queen Isaveth straightened, her hand still resting on Michael's shoulder, and turned to address the council. Her voice carried the formal weight of royal authority being actively exercised rather than merely observed. I have considered carefully the arguments presented regarding military intervention to support our human allies against Verath aggression. The strategic concerns raised by Lord Vethros and others are valid. The resource implications are real. The risks of overextension are substantial. She paused, and Michael could feel the tension in the chamber, everyone waiting to see which direction the Queen would lean, whether she would support the emerging consensus or challenge it. However, Isaveth continued, her skin shifting to decisive purple, I am reminded that treaties are not strategic conveniences to be honored when comfortable and dismissed when difficult. They are commitments that define who we are as an empire and how we are perceived by allies and adversaries alike. Her hand tightened slightly on Michael's shoulder, a gesture small enough that perhaps only he felt it, but significant in its intimacy. We signed mutual defense agreements with Earth, not because humans could offer us equivalent military support in our own conflicts, but because we chose to extend our protection to allies we valued for reasons beyond immediate strategic calculation. We did so knowing that honoring such commitments might one day prove costly or inconvenient. She looked directly at Lord Vethros. That day has arrived, and I find that our honor, our integrity as an empire that keeps its word, matters more than the strategic convenience of technical compliance while avoiding substantive support. The Queen's skin settled into royal purple that signaled unambiguous command. I invoke sovereign authority under treaty provisions and imperial prerogative to commit Thessari military forces to defend human border colonies against Verath aggression. The Third Fleet under Admiral Vethros will deploy immediately with full authorization to engage Verath forces and protect human civilian populations. The chamber erupted in shocked murmuring, some nobles showing outraged crimson, others surprised blue, a few approving gold. This deployment is not subject to council vote, Isaveth continued, her voice cutting through the noise. This is my decision as queen, exercised under treaty authority and sovereign prerogative. I am willing to accept the strategic risks that concern this council, because I am not willing to accept the moral cost of abandoning allies when defense becomes inconvenient. Lord Vethros stood, his skin showing angry crimson barely controlled. Your Majesty, with profound respect, this is highly irregular. The council was moving toward consensus on appropriate response. To override that consensus based on, he gestured toward Michael, and the Queen's hand still on his shoulder. Personal sympathy for a human liaison's emotional appeals undermines the deliberative process that has served this empire for millennia. I did not override the council based on emotional appeals, Isaveth replied calmly, her hand finally lifting from Michael's shoulder, but her position remaining close to him. I exercised sovereign authority based on my judgment about what our treaty commitments require and what our honor demands. Captain Serra's arguments were not emotional, they were factual. Human colonies will fall without our support. Thousands will die or be displaced. That is not strategic abstraction. That is reality that requires response. She looked around the chamber, meeting eyes of various nobles and commanders. I understand that many of you believe this decision is strategically unwise. You may be correct in that assessment, but I am willing to accept strategic risk to honor commitments we made when alliance with Earth was convenient. The debate didn't resume after the Queen's declaration. The chamber remained in murmuring discussion, but no one rose to formally challenge her decision or continue arguing against military intervention. Because Michael was beginning to understand through observation and cultural instinct, when the Queen placed her hand on someone's shoulder, whispered to them, and then invoked sovereign authority, the matter had moved beyond debate. The physical gesture combined with the private whisper signaled something specific in Thessari political culture, that the Queen's decision was based on personal judgment formed through direct connection rather than political calculation, and that challenging it further would be challenging her authority as sovereign rather than merely disagreeing with policy. Lord Vethros clearly wanted to continue arguing. His skin colors and ear positions betrayed his frustration and disagreement. But he didn't speak again. Neither did the other nobles who'd been building consensus against intervention. They understood something about the cultural weight of what had just happened that prevented them from continuing opposition. The council session concluded with formal acknowledgement of the Queen's decision. Military deployment would proceed under her sovereign authority. Details would be coordinated through appropriate military channels. Michael stood through the formalities in a daze, still processing the sudden shift from inevitable defeat to unexpected victory. After the session concluded and the chamber began to empty, Michael was approached by one of the Queen's advisors, an elderly Thessari named Vethros who'd been serving the throne for decades. "Captain Serra," Vethros said quietly, "you are summoned to private audience with Her Majesty. Please follow me." Michael was led through corridors to chambers far from the formal council room, private spaces where the Queen conducted personal business rather than official state functions. Queen Isaveth was waiting, having changed from her formal ceremonial robes into simpler attire that suggested this was unofficial conversation. "You're wondering what just happened in the council chamber," she said without preamble once they were alone. "Yes, Your Majesty," Michael admitted. "I presented arguments that were clearly failing to persuade the council. Then you placed your hand on my shoulder, whispered something, and suddenly the entire outcome changed. I don't fully understand what cultural mechanism I just witnessed." "In Thessari political culture," Isaveth explained, settling into a less formal posture, "there are levels of authority and decision-making. Council deliberation where consensus is built through debate, formal votes where majority determines outcome, and sovereign prerogative where the Queen makes judgment that supersedes deliberative process." "But you could have invoked sovereign prerogative at any time during the debate," Michael observed. "Why wait until the council had essentially reached consensus in the opposite direction?" "Because invoking sovereign prerogative arbitrarily or frequently undermines council legitimacy," the Queen replied. "I use that authority sparingly, only when I believe council consensus would lead to outcomes that violate fundamental principles or commitments that I as sovereign am sworn to uphold." She looked at him seriously. "The gesture I made, placing my hand on your shoulder, whispering to you before announcing my decision, that signals to the court that my judgment is based on personal conviction formed through direct connection rather than political calculation or factional maneuvering." "The whisper became more important than all the public arguments," Michael said, beginning to understand. "The whisper signaled finality," Isaveth corrected. "In our culture, when the sovereign whispers to someone in public court and then invokes authority, it communicates that the matter has moved beyond debate into the realm of personal judgment, that I have reached conviction based on considerations that transcend what can be publicly argued." She paused. "The council understands that challenging such judgment after I have signaled it in that specific way is not merely disagreeing with policy. It's challenging my authority as sovereign judge of character, commitment, and honor. That's a line most political actors are unwilling to cross. So by making it personal and private, by whispering, you made it unchallengeable," Michael realized. "I made it final," the Queen said. "The court understands the cultural weight of that gesture. They may disagree with my assessment. They may believe I am making strategic error, but they cannot challenge the decision without undermining the fundamental structure of our governance, which grants the sovereign ultimate authority in matters of honor and commitment." Michael considered this. "What you actually whispered to me, telling me to trust you, saying that my arguments mattered, that was genuine. But the act of whispering itself was also a political tool." "Both things are true," Isaveth confirmed. "What I said to you was genuine conviction. I heard your arguments and they resonated with me more than the council's strategic calculations. But yes, the act of whispering also carried political weight that made my subsequent decision difficult to challenge." She met his eyes. "You presented arguments that the council was prepared to dismiss as emotional or strategically naive. You spoke from conviction about lives that would be lost and commitments that should be honored. I agreed with you, and I used the cultural weight of intimate gesture and private communication to transform your losing arguments into the basis for sovereign decision. You quieted an entire room without raising your voice, Michael observed. You ended debate through intimacy rather than command. I ended debate by signaling that the matter had moved beyond debate, Isaveth corrected. The whisper communicated that I had reached judgment based on personal conviction rather than political consensus. Once that signal is given, continued argument becomes challenge to sovereign authority itself. Michael was quiet for a moment, processing the layers of meaning in what had happened. May I ask what made you decide to support military intervention when the council consensus was clearly against it? You did, the Queen replied simply. Your arguments about treaty obligations and the moral cost of abandoning allies were correct. The council was making calculations based on strategic convenience while ignoring the fundamental question of what kind of empire we choose to be. Her skin shifted to thoughtful blue. I have been queen for 43 years. I have made decisions based on strategic wisdom, political calculation, careful balance of competing interests. Those decisions were often correct from a strategic standpoint, but there are moments when strategy must yield to principle, when the question is not what is convenient but what is right. And you used your authority to make that principle into policy, Michael said. I used my authority to ensure that principle prevailed over convenient calculation, Isaveth agreed. The gesture, the hand on your shoulder, the whisper, that was the mechanism through which I transformed personal conviction into sovereign decision that could not be easily challenged. Thank you, Michael said, for hearing arguments the council dismissed, for acting when strategic wisdom pointed toward inaction, he struggled for words, for the whisper, for making your conviction visible in a way that mattered. Thank you for presenting arguments worth hearing, the Queen replied, for speaking truth about what our commitments require even when that truth was politically inconvenient, for reminding me that some things matter more than strategic calculation. 3 weeks later, the Third Fleet successfully defended the human border colonies, drove back Verath forces, and established defensive positions that secured the region. The strategic risks that the Council had worried about failed to materialize. The Verath backed down when confronted with serious Thessari military commitment, and other contested regions remained stable. Lord Vethros, in a private conversation with the Queen, grudgingly acknowledged, "Your Majesty's judgment proved sound. The intervention succeeded and the strategic costs were manageable. I may have overestimated the risks. Or I may have been fortunate that circumstances aligned favorably," Isaveth replied graciously. Strategic wisdom is not always wrong simply because principle demands different action. You raised legitimate concerns. I simply concluded that honor mattered more than risk avoidance in this instance. But privately, with Michael during one of their increasingly frequent consultations about human Thessari cooperation, she reflected on what had actually happened in the council chamber. "I've been thinking about that moment," she told him, "when I placed my hand on your shoulder and whispered about what it meant and why it worked. I've been thinking about it too," Michael admitted, "trying to understand the cultural mechanisms I witnessed." "The whisper is not about secrecy," Isaveth explained. "Everyone in that chamber knew I was speaking to you. They watched me lean close. They saw the intimacy of the gesture. The point was not to hide what I said, but to make visible the act of saying it privately. Making the private communication public without making the words public," Michael observed. "Exactly. The cultural understanding is that when a sovereign whispers to someone in open court, the content of the whisper is less important than the act itself. The whisper signals that the sovereign has moved beyond hearing public arguments and has reached conviction based on private judgment." She paused, considering her words. "In our culture, there's a recognition that some truths cannot be adequately expressed through public debate. That personal conviction, formed through direct connection and private communication, can be more valid than consensus built through political maneuvering. So the whisper carries authority precisely because it's not public argument, Michael said. The whisper carries authority because it signals the sovereign's personal investment in the decision, Isaveth corrected. It communicates that I am not merely weighing political factors, but exercising judgment based on direct assessment of character, commitment, and truth. She looked at him seriously. When I placed my hand on your shoulder and whispered to you, I was telling the court, I have assessed this human directly. I have heard his conviction. I have formed judgment based on that direct connection. My decision follows from that judgment, rather than from the political calculations you have been debating. And that judgment cannot be challenged without challenging your authority as sovereign, Michael said. Cannot easily be challenged, Isaveth corrected. There are always mechanisms for disagreement in our political system, but challenging a decision that I have signaled in that specific way, through intimate gesture and private communication, requires questioning my capacity for judgment itself, not merely disagreeing with policy. That's a high bar for opposition, Michael observed. It's meant to be, the Queen replied. Sovereign prerogative exists precisely for moments when political consensus would lead to outcomes that violate fundamental principles. The whisper is the cultural mechanism that signals such prerogative, is being invoked based on conviction rather than whim. Michael was quiet for a moment. You took a significant political risk to support human colonies. Used your authority in ways that will have lasting implications for how you can exercise power in future situations. Why? Because you were right, Isaveth said simply. Because treaties mean nothing if we only honor them when convenient. Because thousands of human lives mattered more than strategic calculations about resource allocation. And because I believe that being the kind of empire that keeps its word, even when costly, matters more than being the kind of empire that makes strategically optimal decisions. She smiled slightly, also because I could. Because I recognized that this was exactly the kind of situation where sovereign prerogative exists, when political consensus leads toward outcomes that violate core principles. The whisper was the tool through which I transformed that recognition into decision that could prevail over consensus. Years later, when Michael had returned to Earth and was teaching at the military academy about alliance dynamics and cross-cultural diplomacy, he would tell the story of the day the Thessari queen placed her hand on his shoulder and whispered once. How that single gesture, intimate, deliberate, culturally weighted, had quieted an entire council chamber. How a whisper heard by no one except its intended recipient had outweighed hours of public debate. How authority could be exercised through trust made visible rather than through command voiced loudly. He would explain to students that power sometimes speaks most effectively when it speaks quietly. That the most unchallengeable decisions are sometimes the ones framed as personal conviction rather than political calculation. That a hand on a shoulder and a few whispered words can carry more weight than the most elaborate public arguments. Because the Queen had understood something fundamental, that in Thessari culture, intimacy could convey authority more effectively than command. That private communication made public through gesture could be more powerful than any decree proclaimed from the throne. She placed her hand on his shoulder. She whispered once. The room went silent, and in that silence everything changed, not because she demanded it, but because the gesture itself carried cultural weight that transcended argument and reduced debate to irrelevance. Authority through trust, power through intimacy. Silence achieved not through commanded quiet but through cultural recognition that the matter had moved beyond debate into the realm of sovereign judgment exercised through personal conviction. Michael had presented losing arguments that the council was prepared to dismiss. The Queen touched his shoulder and whispered, and suddenly those arguments became the basis for decisions that saved thousands of lives and honored commitments that strategic wisdom would have abandoned. because she chose to signal trust publicly, because she made her conviction visible through gesture rather than proclamation, because she understood that sometimes the most powerful statements are the ones whispered privately while the entire world watches. The hand on the shoulder, the whispered words, the room falling silent, that was enough. That was everything. The gesture that ended debate through intimacy rather than command, the whisper that spoke louder than any public argument. The moment when power expressed itself through chosen proximity and private communication made visible for all to witness. Because when the Queen whispers, everyone understands. The matter is final, not because she commanded it, but because she chose it, and made that choice visible through trust offered in a gesture too intimate for ceremony, too deliberate to ignore, too culturally weighted to challenge without questioning the throne itself. That was the story. That was the truth. The day a queen's whisper changed everything by making personal conviction into sovereign decision that no amount of strategic argument could overcome. She placed her hand on his shoulder. She whispered once. The room went silent. And from that silence, victory snatched from defeat, commitments honored despite convenience,